My name is Ted. I work for a company called Sentinel. It is not the Sentinel you're thinking of. They're Sentinel 1, and they're right outside the door there. We're not the other Sentinel you're thinking of, which is Azure, Sentinel, Microsoft. We're also not the MSP based in Illinois. We're the fourth Sentinel that's going to come to mind. We've been around a long time, Sentinel Intrusion Prevention Systems. It's a terrible name for two reasons. Number one, the Sentinel name that I just described. Number two, Intrusion Prevention Systems implies that basically all we do is IPS. If you're familiar with IPS as a technology, it's been around a long time. We do a lot more than that. We're changing our name this year. Next time you see me, we'll have a different name. So all of that to say, today we're going to talk about CIS controls in the real world. Who is familiar with CIS controls already? Who's in here because they've heard of it, but they don't really know what's up with it? Like CIS controls curious, you might say. Okay, so yeah, we're going to give you kind of an overview and sort of why it's important and talk through some examples from the real world, from our experience, related to the CIS controls. So first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to learn CIS controls really quick. We're going to learn all the controls in 10 minutes. It'll be the most beneficial 10 minutes you've ever spent. And then we're going, like I mentioned, we're going to go through some real-world examples of the CIS controls, and then hopefully there's some takeaways for you that are valuable. We don't really like to stand up in front of people and say things without giving you at least some benefit, right? So, and of course, I'm more than open to answer questions, take comments, try to manage hecklers, whatever, during this presentation. So please, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'd be happy to, or an experience maybe that relates to what we're doing. Totally okay with comments and questions, right? So CIS controls, we're going to get started on this 10 minutes of fun here. So CIS controls, the who and the what, that's the who. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the what. Who gets the joke about the who? And you may, okay, that's good. So the what on CIS controls, created by the Center for Internet Security, the CIS. Who's familiar with the MS-ISAC or ISACs in general? Okay, so an ISAC is an Information Sharing and Analysis Center. There are many, many, many of them. Pretty much every vertical, every business vertical has an ISAC related to it. So one of the larger, more known ones is the financial ISAC. So these are information groups that all of these companies within a vertical belong to. Okay, so in the financial ISAC, you've got Chase and Bank of America and Wells Fargo and all of those kind of people. In the MS ISAC, that stands for multi-state. So the multi-state ISAC is city, county, state governments. So this is a government, quasi-government, one of those kind of quasi-government organizations that provides resources and threat intelligence and sharing information to cities, counties, and states governments. They also provide some free services. They also provide some services that are not so free. But that's who, and then the EI ISAC is the election ISAC. So when you hear about, when you hear comments from the government, from the CISA, or people like that, talking about all the controversy that happened in 2020, some of that's coming from the election ISAC. Those are people that are sharing threat information across all the organizations that run elections. Okay. Very long explanation for a single bullet point, but I want you to know kind of the context of where this came from. They used to be called the CIS 20, okay? And in their own words, it's prioritized set of actions to protect your organization and data from known cyber attack vectors. A very fancy way to say it's a cybersecurity to-do list. All right, if you're in an organization, how many of you are sort of in charge of your organization? IT or cyber, one of those two, right? Okay. So this is, the whole idea behind this is, you get plunked into a situation where you're told you need to handle cyber for your organization. And maybe you don't do cyber. Maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you're new to it. Maybe you do it, but it's only you. So where do you start? Okay, this is how you start. The CIS controls is built for that. That's the purpose of this organization and this group. So it's much easier to digest than, say, NIST or some of these other cybersecurity frameworks that are out there. It's based on NIST and some of these other frameworks. So if you can do the CIS controls, you're going to check a lot of boxes on NIST as well. It's kind of almost a way to cheat because it's easier. It's like the Cliff's Notes version of NIST. And it's not the same as a mandatory compliance framework. Okay, so this is not compliance per se. It's more of a framework or a guideline. So this isn't HIPAA, this isn't high trust, this isn't PCI, it's not a mandatory framework. But it is, again, a framework, a to-do list to help you out. So that's kind of the basics of what the CIS controls are. And in version 8, so version 8 came out last year, almost exactly a year ago. And what version 8 did, if you're familiar at all with the previous versions, this thing used to be called, I think I mentioned already, it used to be called the CIS 20. That was what it was called. They can't call it that anymore. Version 8 came out, they rearranged everything, they dropped a couple controls and they renamed some others and reorganized things. Now it's 18, and CIS 18 doesn't sound good, so now they just call it the CIS controls. So they also changed subcontrols. So it used to be you had these 18 or 20 controls, and then within each of those controls, and we'll see some eventually, I promise, within each of those controls there's 10 or 12 different sub-controls. Well, they didn't want to use the name controls so often, so they started calling them safeguards. One of the reasons I put that in the presentation is so that I remember to use the word safeguards instead of sub-controls, okay? So it's an important addition. One of the new ones that they have, that they've put in that's very topical, to just give you an example of how they've changed the CIS controls, service provider management, fancy way of saying supply chain. So we've all heard of supply chain attacks recently, how important those are. Service provider management is CIS controls' way of saying you need to pay attention to your vendors and your vendors' vendors and the cybersecurity through that entire chain. So that's what service provider management is. Maps to other frameworks, like I mentioned. So there are all kinds of tools online, and here's another tool called the CSAT. There are all kinds of tools for CIS controls to get you started. Nobody expects you to go online, Google CIS controls, print off a PDF, and just start checking boxes. That would be rather old school. So there are tons of tools online provided by the MSISAC and the CIS for tracking your progress, doing self-assessments of your progress, all those sorts of things you can track online, and it makes your life a lot easier. And like I said, they map to other frameworks. So if somebody does tell you, hey, I want you to follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, or the state of Texas has their own cybersecurity framework, if they tell you that, you can start here, and it's an easier way to start, and you'll start checking those boxes, okay? And then since version 7.1, so not version 8, but the previous version, they implemented what are called implementation groups. And it's going to be one of the more important takeaways from this presentation is understanding what implementation groups are. So they help provide that prioritization. My whole point of doing this, and the people I'm speaking to in the room and virtually, is those people that are looking for help in prioritizing their cybersecurity. It's very difficult to walk outside this door to the 40 vendors that are standing there waiting to tell you everything they do, and for you to decide what's most important for your network. If you have a goal going in of the tools you're looking for and a strategy, you got a much better shot at picking the right stuff, right? And that's what this can help you do. All right, so implementation groups. Let's go ahead and talk about those. So think of the original CIS controls before implementation groups as like a Word document, and it's in outline form. And on the first indent of the outline are the 20 controls. Now there are 18, the 18 controls, right? And then within those controls are those sub-controls or safeguards, which are indented one bullet point, right? Implementation groups introduces the idea of more like a matrix, more like a spreadsheet, okay? So in addition to those indents, you're going to have 3 columns for each of those safeguards that are going to have an implementation group on them. 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to talk about what those mean, of course. Implementation group 1, you're going to get sick of me saying IG1. Implementation group 1, IG1. Those are the basic, low-hanging fruit for cybersecurity. They cover something like 85% of the attack surface of your network, and they're relatively cheap, relatively easy, relatively no-brainer things to do for your network. It's by far and away the best bang for your buck, okay? So these are called IG1, cyber hygiene. Generally, if you're a small team, you have limited IT, cybersecurity expertise or personnel, who's a part of an organization where it's basically just you or a small handful of people, okay? All right, so if that's you, these are the ones you focus on first because most likely you don't have a lot of these bases covered because your organization is so small. And it's generally for general non-targeted attacks, which the targeted attacks and some of those other things are what grabs the headlines, but the vast majority of the attacks that come at you are exploits and crimes of opportunity, right? And those can be mitigated by this IG1. So, IG2. Maybe you have an IT or cybersecurity on staff. You've got a handful of people that you're working with, but you have to manage multiple departments, okay? Accounting, IT, software development, administration, whatever it happens to be. Possibly you have some regulatory things, like I mentioned before, like HIPAA or PCI that you have to pay attention to, but this is a more sophisticated organization that might be able to take on some more sophisticated cybersecurity implementations. So, and then IG3 is enterprise. And enterprise is honestly not who I'm talking to in this group, okay? If you're enterprise, you probably have your own security staff, you're a member of that staff, you might even have a SOC, Security Operations Center, built into your organization, something like that. You're gonna be more sophisticated, your emphasis is gonna be on that last difficult 5 or 10%, the 0 days that by definition, they're 0 days, so they're sort of impossible to stop, right? But that's what you're going after because you have all your other bases are covered. So, in our experience, pretty much everybody we deal with is an IG2 organization, but you're on an IG1 budget, okay? You have who doesn't have multiple departments, right? Who has just one department they're managing? That's impossible, okay? But you have an IG1 budget. You're struggling to find the funds you need to get done what you need to get done. So pretty much most of our customers are IG2 organizations, but they're on an IG1 budget, so they really have to prioritize this stuff and get it figured out. So where we fit in. This is the closest thing you're going to hear to a sales pitch from us, but the point of this is to give you context about what we do. So if you see the little shield here, in the middle of that diagram, you see that little shield there. That is, we do several things. We have a device on the inside that does inside visibility. We have a SOC right here in local Richardson, Texas. And we manage and monitor our devices. But for the context of what we're going to talk about, these real world examples, they all come from that device with the little shield there that is sitting between the ISP router and the firewall. It's external of the network. So I just want you to know the context of all these examples I'm about to talk about. They all come from trouble tickets and proactive support from our SOC based on that device, the external device. Okay, does that make sense? And you'll see why that's important because some of the ways we handle some of these support issues with our customers are because of the visibility limitations or successes we have based on where that device sits, okay? All right, so that is basically, like I said, the closest thing you're going to get to a sales pitch. So where do we fit in? We fit in if you're trying to check boxes on the CIS controls for things like network monitoring and defense, or support and monitoring, or boundary defense in the old school way it was called. That's where you'd be looking for a tool like ours, okay? But the whole point of this presentation is to show you that we see in real world examples cracks in the foundation where some of those early implementation groups for the cyber hygiene aren't being fulfilled. Therefore, we see examples of things that fall to us, basically. We're a safety net for some other things that, quite honestly, should have been caught by tools that solve those IG1 problems. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to jump in right away with this TELNET mystery example. I apologize to the people that are watching virtually on the camera. I'm going to step away from the camera so that I can read some of the stuff that's on the screen, okay? So I'll be right back. TELNET mystery. First thing is that, oh, I forgot my little clicker. This is a state agency in Texas, okay? This happened in 2020. High volume of suspected Mirai-related events. So we have a trouble ticket that we open up, and we say, hey, you've got TELNET, port 23, publicly exposed on your network, okay? and it is getting hammered with login attempts on TELNET, right? First of all, it shouldn't be available publicly. And then obviously when you're seeing all this brute force, it raises some concern. So we reach out to the customers and we ask this customer, what's going on here? What's behind this? So we see this IP, it's behind our external device, right? And we ask them what it is. And he responds with, hey, port 23 isn't open on the firewall. So the firewall sits behind our device, right? Doesn't see port 23 open. There's nothing there. So why are these events happening? Why are we seeing all of this incoming brute force if that port isn't even open? Well, we can prove to him through some traffic analysis and some PCAPs. We can say, hey, we see this traffic. Okay, this is actually happening. So where is this device? It's obviously not behind the firewall. There's something else going on here, okay? So through a questioning, we do say it's possible that this device sits outside the firewall. So it's sitting next to the firewall. It's out here, kind of floating out in a DMZ-ish sort of zone, okay? And traceroutes confirm the device is outside the firewall. Current status. So we let him know he's got this device outside the firewall. He didn't know to look outside the firewall for this device, right? What's the current status of this? The customer thinks it's a VMware server. He's not 100% sure what this device is. This is 2 years ago, okay? Current status of this is still this is the case. This device is still sitting out there and he's not 100% sure what it even is, okay? It could be IoT related. It could be like a camera system, like a server that manages their camera system on site, right? Like an on-prem device that manages IoT, something like that. Could be that. And in that case, he has no control over the software that's on it, right? But the truth is we don't know for sure. And this is when I sort of backtrack a little bit from what I said a minute ago. It sounded like I was bashing him, right? I'm not. I'm not bashing him. He has 200 things to do. And this is number 198 on the list. We already told him we're blocking this traffic, that there are login attempts that are concerning, but we're blocking it. We just notice it, and he's got something going on that he should know about, right? So Sentinel is serving as a safety net here, right? This is not the purpose of our device. The purpose of our device is not to manage an open port, okay? That's not what we do, okay? Or, in this case of the CIS controls, okay, we're going to start with this major cliche number one. Okay, major cliche number one is safeguard 1.1. Where do you start on CIS controls? I mentioned before that we start with IG1, and then I'm going to say that a lot. So if you look at control 1.1, it's the very first control when you print that PDF and you start reading it. It's the very first control, and it says, establish and maintain detailed enterprise asset inventory. Fancy way of saying know what's on your network. Ever heard that before? Right? If you're trying to protect your network, you can't protect what you don't know you have. That's cliche number one, and it happens to be the very first control listed, the very first safeguard / subcontrol listed, and it's an IG1, right? It's in implementation group 1 for a reason. If you're just getting started with the stuff, you look for the green dots, okay? And you're going to find one right off the bat in the very first control, okay? So that's cliche number one. And again, I'm not bashing him in this case. He's got a lot going on. But again, if he knew what was on his network, he could have solved this problem very, very quickly, and we wouldn't be necessarily dealing with it. But he doesn't have time to deal with it. It's difficult for him to do asset management in his organization the way it's currently stated. But if you're following the CIS controls, you're going to say, okay, well, that just got bumped up on my priority list, because they're telling me to do this. They're telling me it's critical, it's important. Okay, so example number 2, the web proxy party. This is a school district in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Again, I don't know if I mentioned it, but we're based here. We're based in, this is home turf for us. We have a lot of customers, city, counties, and states around this area in DFW. So this is a school district. And we saw an unusual high volume of outbound events. What I described before in the previous example, a lot of inbound sort of just brute forcing or exploits, things like that. But we also serve as a safety net for outbound events, things that endpoint protection doesn't catch or your firewall doesn't catch. We're going to catch it on the outside, and we're going to let you know that that happened. We call it EPS. It's a play on the old school term IPS. It means extrusion instead of intrusion. That doesn't matter, but it's important to know that these are really critical events. If you've gotten an alert that has been generated from inside your network and it has made it past the endpoint, the firewall, and made it to us, you know that's bad. That's when you get an event like that, you jump up, okay? So, an unusually high volume of these. It's a school district, okay? School districts are pretty well known for being it's like herding cats, right? You got tons and tons of devices on the network that come in and out, all that sort of thing. But even knowing that and knowing that there's tons of things going on here, you've got tons of these outbound events. So we reach out to them, and we notice that this traffic is coming from all over the world, okay? So how can we decide, and this just happened, it bumped up in like a day. This traffic just spiked in terms of all of these outbound alerts, right? And we look at the traffic and it's coming from all over the world, things bouncing in and out from everywhere. So we ask them, hey, what's going on here? This is really strange. And they said, well, we implemented this new web proxy yesterday. We turned on a web proxy, right? And we said, oh, well, that sort of makes sense. It's the right port. So we're seeing all of this traffic on port 8080 coming in from all over the world and leaving the network. You guys familiar with like VPN services that allow you to watch European soccer games for free because they're in Europe or whatever? This is kind of the poor man's version of that. People all over the world found this web proxy and jumped through it so they could have an IP that was a US IP, and they could do, watch Netflix or whatever they wanted to do from all over the world. Or scan networks, or do whatever they needed to do through this web proxy. All right, so what we found was they had just implemented this new web proxy service. They reached out to that service, and they found out there was a patch for their content filtering piece. As soon as they implemented the patch, software updated, events stopped, traffic normal, all good. Okay, so we have cliche number 2 coming. First cliche was know what's on your network, right? What do you think the second most common cliche is? Keep your stuff patched. You ever heard that? Has anybody ever told you to keep your stuff patched? Right? So notice these are IG1s, right? These are kind of the easy, low-hanging fruit things. So 7.3 says perform automated operating system patch management, and then the next one is application patch management. So that's the idea here. Patch your stuff. Know what's on your network and patch your stuff. And the whole idea about putting these in implementation group 1, I'm going to say this until I'm blue in the face, the whole idea behind implementation group 1 is you may be doing other things. You may be enamored by a shiny tool that's out there. Somebody may have told you about this important tool, or you should really fix this or that. What these people are telling you is stop, pause, go do this easy stuff first, okay? I say easy. I realize that asset management and patch management and solving those problems are not all that easy. But I think a lot of people avoid them because they may or may not think they're super important. What the CIS controls are telling you is no, they're critical. Okay? They're critical for protecting your network. And we get a bonus out of this one. So I mentioned that service provider management CIS control earlier. The idea here is this is a vendor's software that was causing this problem. If you're staying on top of your vendors and your supply chain, then you can prevent this problem from happening. Of course, I'm not throwing these guys under the bus. They were 1 day into an implementation, okay? Things go wrong, it's understandable. But it took us reaching out, right? Again, not what we were necessarily intended to do, but it took us reaching out and sort of raising a hand and letting them know, hey, you got something going on here, right? Easy fix, no problem. But it took sort of that safety net to get it working. So, example number 3. Any questions on these, by the way? We all good? Okay. Yeah, so number 3, SMB for the win. This is an old school one. This is 2017. And if anybody remembers WannaCry, which has sort of made a comeback, okay? But WannaCry was all the rage until somebody stumbled over the kill switch and was able to kill it. But it was all the rage, and it was part of a larger thing, of the release of the Eternal Blue tools from the NSA through Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and all that. Big story. If you didn't read it, it's a fascinating story. But anyway, that had an effect on all of these small organizations that we protect. And one of them was an exploit of SMB version 1. If you know SMB version 1, you know that's like 12, 14 years ago. Like, it's a really old version. But who has notoriously old Windows servers running on their network right now that they wish didn't exist? Like, okay, there we go. So who's willing to admit they have old Windows servers running on there? So an exploit of SMB1, again, SMB, I mean, it shouldn't be exposed anyway, and it's this really old version, right? So you think these things are old or they're not important, but it's this low-hanging fruit. Again, it's an example of low-hanging fruit. So what did we do? We noticed a spike in SMB-related alerts on specific customer networks. We noticed a spike. It's really interesting. When you plug one of our devices on the outside of the network, we're sitting there, right, in line, but you can tell what's on somebody's network simply based on the bad traffic you see directed at it. You can tell what's on the network. We're not scanning the network and looking for ports, and that, I mean, we can, but we're generally, just based on the alerts that trip and just based on the scans we see, we can tell what's on the network. And this is a really good example. We see this uptick in SMB traffic and SMB alerts on the networks that actually had SMB open, right? And running and had this possible exploit. This vulnerability was there. All right, so we reach out and we notified, we had this little project, this little side project where we identified, I forget how many customers had this issue, and we reached out to them and opened tickets for all of them, and we said, hey, we've seen this uptick, and here's our intrepid support person saying there's one or more Windows boxes on your network, SMB services are open, Microsoft has responded with these patches, make sure you patch all your systems, and cut and paste to several dozen customers for this. So we notified all our customers of these alerts, and so one replies, hey, what did he say exactly? Let's see here. So they fixed this issue, but they said, we didn't have SMB open. That wasn't a thing. So back to my original example where, hey, that port wasn't open on the firewall. Remember that example? This is kind of a similar response. They came back and they said, yeah, we have SMB v1 blocked on the firewall. There's no way this is a problem, right? And we said, well, through trace routes and stuff, we can tell that this traffic is happening. So that's curious, that's interesting. So they got into the firewall, couldn't figure out what was going on, called their firewall vendor. I think it was Palo Alto. I don't mind mentioning like other companies up here, no big deal. We're all friends. So I think it was Palo, and they called up Palo and they said, hey man, I got this thing going on, what's going on here? And they tracked it down, took a couple hours on the phone to realize that the rule that they had was there, but it wasn't implemented. Okay, so maybe they forgot to push submit. Maybe the rule was to, anybody ever misconfigure a firewall? Right? I mean, has anybody ever put a rule in incorrectly, or maybe drop traffic they didn't mean to, or something like that? So whatever the case may be, whether it was a case of the web interface kind of died on the vine before it submitted, or whatever it happened to be, but they didn't know it. And so the rule had been in there for a long time, but it wasn't actually running. So they fixed it. They tracked it down to a misconfiguration of rules on the firewall. It was like the order of the rules or something, some weird bug, and they got it fixed, and the problem stopped. The problem went away. So not the SMB was not the issue. The problem was a misconfiguration on the firewall. So we go to the CIS controls and we look and we say, what can guide us to try to keep track of these things and make sure that these sort of things don't happen? We look at Safeguard 4.2, lo and behold, it's implementation group 1, of course, it's an IG1, and it says, establish and maintain secure configuration process for network infrastructure. So, cliche number 3. Okay? Number 1, know what's on your network. Number 2, make sure it's patched. Number 3, make sure it's configured correctly. Okay? So what they would tell you is, Again, I don't care what shiny tool you're interested in buying, you're better off spending your time making sure everything you've got on your network is implemented correctly and configured correctly. You're going to stop a lot more problems doing that than buying necessarily the most shiny new tool that's out there. Okay? So that's the idea. And then my final example of the day, it's a bonus because I love you. This is called WORLD-RYUK madness. So WORLD-RYUK, took me a while to figure out how to pronounce that. Anybody hear of WORLD-RYUK before? It's ransomware. It's gone in and out of favor over time. So this is a city in Texas from right before the pandemic hit. And there's this pattern that you would see back in the day. Emotet is a group, actually, that's gone in and out of favor. The FBI's gone in and torn the group down. They come back up. They pop up under a different name. The tools that they use pop up and used in different ways. It's a name you see kind of go in and out if you follow this sort of thing. So Emotet has this toolkit, malware toolkit, that includes something called DryDex TrickBot, which is good for moving laterally on a network, okay? And then once they move laterally on the network, they would implement WORLD-RYUK ransomware. So this was a pattern you could notice. You'd start seeing evidence of Emotet tools being used. Then you would specifically see DryDex. And then after they got established where they wanted to be established, boom, you'd get hit with WORLD-RYUK ransomware. So it was this pattern that was established back in 2020. And so we see Emotet-related events on one of our customers. So we reach out and we say, hey, you got something going on, okay? We're seeing a spike in Emotet alerts that appear to be legitimate. So early on, if you see these Emotet alerts, they appear to be legitimate because they have a tendency to false positive. They may or may not be actually Emotet. Well, we dug into it. We said, no, these are legit. You should really take a look at these. The Sentinel is blocking the C2, the command and control, server IPs as they appear, but we strongly urge you to track these hosts down. So we told them we're blocking this traffic, but we know how this works, right? We know that they are targeting their network. They're using these tools. This is not your regular drive-by scan thing. This is kind of a higher level. So we're blocking the traffic right now, but we know how this goes down. They'll find a way. Whatever that way is, they will find a way. So, and that's kind of one of those cautionary tales too. If somebody out there tells you, we got you 100% covered, you don't have to worry about anything, don't buy another tool, whatever the case may be, that's where you shake their hand, you turn around, you walk away. Because you just, you got to understand that this is a cat and mouse game over time, right? So anyway. Customer wasn't immediately responsive. We made the mistake, again, of saying in this email, we're blocking the traffic. So, 200 things to do. This is 198 on the list. We probably shouldn't have said we're blocking the traffic. We probably should have said something like there's a fire in your office. Okay? But anyway, so they weren't immediately responsive. So, guess what happens? A few days later, step number 2, DryDex. Took a few days, but we start seeing DryDex and TrickBot on the network, and we reach out, and we make a phone call, and we update the ticket, and we say, we are now seeing this, and now we let them in on the whole idea of the Emotet to this, to that, and if you wait too long, it's going to be ransomware, okay? So we let them in on that little clue, and we send them links on how it works, and we keep them updated. Well, that got their attention. So they requested a phone call. And we help them track down the host. So in this particular case, there's a host on the inside of the network. Again, I mentioned before, early on in the presentation, our device sits on the outside of the network. So we didn't have visibility in this particular customer. We do have inside visibility in other customers, but in this particular customer, we didn't have that. So we had to work with them a little bit. Okay, go to your firewall logs, look at these, find the access to those command and control servers. We'll help you. Here are some logs you can look at. And they were able to track down the host that was tripping this alerts, and they were able to wipe it and fix it. So the idea here is, before ransomware, by the way, so they weren't busted by that. Tons of different examples in the CIS controls we could choose from here. Okay, it's like a grab bag. Okay, so I picked one of my favorites. Control number 9, Safeguard 9.2. Use DNS filtering services. Who has a DNS filter on their network? OpenDNS, Umbrella, whatever tool you might, whatever your favorite is. IG1, of course, implementation group 1. I picked this one because it's one of my favorite tools that we are not, okay? Fairly easy to implement, fairly effective, fairly inexpensive. Agreed? Everybody agree with that? So, piece of cake. In this particular case, these are known alerts that we're tripping. This is not some fancy zero-day thing. These are known things, known command and control servers that were being used, known domains that would have been sinkholed immediately had they had a DNS filtering service when Sally in accounting clicked on the link, right? That's probably what happened in this case. So you could pick a bunch of other tools that would prevent sort of a known example of this thing happening. But what's the real moral of the story? We get to cliche number 4, our biggest cliche of all. What do you think is the big, did you read it? Did I spoil it already? What do you think is the biggest cliche of all? You guys have users on your network? You have like human beings that do things that you don't want them to do, right? Like that's the biggest cliche of them all, right? So phishing. So we're going to use phishing as an example here. Notice, well, first of all, I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second on this. I think if even as recent as right before the pandemic hit and we were doing these shows and we were talking to each other, the dialogue at the time was, gosh, our users are dumb. I wish we didn't have to deal with that. All those sorts of things. I think the languaging is switching, and I think it's a good thing. The language is switching around how you deal with this particular issue. If somebody who has like KnowBe4 or something like that, a tool, a testing tool, right? So now if you've got a tool like that where you're sending out fake phishing emails and tracking people's progress and that sort of thing, it used to be you'd get in trouble for something like that, right? You might get shamed. So what effect does that have? It has a chilling effect, doesn't it? They're not going to come to you if they see a problem because they think they're going to get in trouble. So the message is shifting now where we want to build, in fact we do an entire presentation on this, building trust in your relationships with your users so that they come to you with a problem instead of being shamed. So anyway, that's the soapbox. I'll stand down from the soapbox now and say that in the case of phishing, we're talking about control number 14. So this is buried a little bit. This is a good example of if you don't have implementation groups, where do you start with the CIS controls? Are you going to start at 14 randomly? You wouldn't know to do that, right? So 14 is security awareness and skills training. Notice how many of those controls, hopefully you can see the screen, how many of those controls have IG1, have a green dot? All of them, every single one of them, right? So somebody putting this together said, this is really important, and we should do every single one of these things, right? So again, if you're running out of this room to go buy one of the shiny tools that's out there, and you're not doing something like KnowBe4 or I promise I don't work for KnowBe4. Like if you don't have something like that in place, the CIS controls are telling you this is a high priority, you should implement this, right? So, by the way, 14.2 says specifically train workforce members to recognize social engineering attacks, which is what happened in this particular case. So, we have some takeaways. We got lunch coming pretty soon, right? So, yeah, so we have some takeaways here. Get creative. Use your existing tools that you have. Obviously, the examples I gave are of customers that have our tool. In our particular case, we were the safety net that caught a bunch of this stuff. But with CIS controls successfully implemented, IG1 successfully implemented, they would have never heard from us. They would have never gotten to the point where they received the alerts from us. So get creative. Use your existing tools. You do have existing tools out there. Firewall logs, EDR, antivirus, those sorts of things that can clue you in to find symptoms of larger issues where you might not normally look. Okay, so another way of saying that is don't just treat the symptoms. Okay, Don't say, oh, well, my antivirus caught that, or my EDR caught that. Aren't I lucky? Look a step deeper and see if that was a symptom of something larger, some larger issue, right? So another fancy sort of funny way to say that is don't treat your safety nets like hammocks, okay? Don't rely on those safety nets necessarily. Try to get past that. Don't lean on those visibility tools like ours as a solution. Now, of course, I'm going to preach. It sounds like I'm trying to not sell our product. That's not what I mean by that. You know, you want layers of protection, obviously. I could do a whole treatise on layered security and defense in depth and all of those sort of old school terms. But try not to lean on those tools as the solution. Keep working to find those underlying issues. And because you have those tools, back to point number one, you can use those tools to find those symptoms, right? Well, now we're back to that slide that said you're an IG2 organization, but you're an IG1 budget. So you can sit out there and you can say, well, I have no money for this. I have no funding. I have no time, right? Well, if you can get creative and you can use those existing tools, reports from your existing tools, reports from our Sentinel device, whatever it was, and you look at those events, and now you've got this other thing called the CIS Controls, an implementation group 1. And now you have this outside resource that is telling you that this is really important. Those 4 cliches that I mentioned are super important, and others, but I just highlighted 4 of them. Now you've got evidence from your existing tools married to an outside resource that is vetted and proven to be successful. You marry those 2 things together, and now you're stating your case better, right? You're making a better case for what you're trying to do. And maybe, just maybe, you can take that to the boss when budget time rolls around. And we serve a lot of, as you can probably tell, we serve a lot of city, county, state governments. So we work with them, like right now, in May. Most of those fiscal years are October 1st. So they're putting together their budget right now. Okay, they're going through their budget process. And so we help them with this. A lot of our customers will reach out and say, can you help us produce a report that shows the effectiveness of blah, blah, blah. It's not just validating our tool itself, it's helping them dig in and fund another tool, an additional tool in their toolbox, right? So hopefully that makes sense and is helpful. And we do have some resources online. You can come by our booth, by the way. We're on kind of the far side of the room. And we have an ebook, Essential Guide to Successful Implementation. We have a Zoom webinar that we did with one of our customers that is a wizard at CIS Controls and uses all these online tools to help implement that. He's the CISO of a city in Texas and a super nice guy. And so we did a webinar with him early in the pandemic that is super informative. And we also have other resources. We have different blogs on our site, and I'd love to talk to you about it. I love standing up here and telling you about it, but I don't claim to be an expert on the implementation itself of this. But I can definitely tell you war stories and point you in the right direction if you want to talk about things. Okay, so any questions or comments or anything related to that? I've brought tea and lemonade to the room for you if you're interested in that. I just clap my hands and they bring in lunch, and it's wonderful. Any questions at all? Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it. Do you want me to serve? Oh, was there a question?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's fine. In that one example where you found a vulnerability behind your solution, you said earlier that you don't necessarily scan when you get in.
Yeah.
Was there a reason you didn't scan? And that's, I mean, because I would have thought the only thing to do is just first scan.
Sure. So he's asking, there was a vulnerability behind our device. Why didn't we scan or find that vulnerability? Because that's not what we do. We're not a vulnerability scanning company. Our internal, well, funny story, our internal device used to have that functionality built into it, and nobody bought it. Nobody wanted it. So we sort of yanked that software off. We used to be a Qualys reseller. We still do it for some customers externally if they want. We'll still do it. But it's really not what we do. So that's the answer to your question. It's just not what we do. But that's what I find curious, is that even without actually scanning, now we will ad hoc in a support situation. Like if we're doing incident response for somebody or we're digging deeper into an alert, from our device, it's a pretty good point in the network to kind of turn backwards and do some scanning and that sort of thing, sort of ad hoc, but it's not really a service per se, you know. But again, what I find fascinating is you can just look at the bad traffic. That's all we really log. Our reports are all the alerts that trip. We're not telling you necessarily the good stuff that's happening on your network. All we're telling you in our reporting, in our device, is all the bad stuff, right? But you can tell from network to network to network. What you see in the bad stuff will tell you what's on the network. Like you can tell that people are attracted to networks that have these open ports, or they'll find a vulnerability or whatever it may be. So it's, to me, that's pretty fascinating. So.
Did you say you could see east-west traffic inside the network?
Well, in these, I was trying to be specific in these examples. These are all the north-south outside, but yes, we do have internal visibility devices as well that we manage. It's just the context for this particular presentation was the outside device.
So do companies replace their MSP with you guys? Like, so I have an MSP that's looking at SIM and looking at all my alerts, but I think that's a little late, right? It's kind of late in the game.
Yeah, so
Could I replace my MSP with
it depends on what they're doing. Obviously, an MSP could be providing multiple things. We're not in the endpoint business. We're not in the SIEM business. But what we do for, again, our company focus is on these smaller organizations. So the device on the outside is really meant to hide your network, right? Keep the bad guys off of it. Make sure if there are misconfigurations in the firewall or whatever it is that they're just not seen. So that's effect number one. But on the inside of the network, if your SIM is too complicated to manage, you have an MSP that's managing it for you, but it may be a cost factor. Maybe you don't think it's very effective. There's been this sort of boomerang effect over the past 5 years, I would say, in everybody was SIM, SOC, 24/7 SOC, right? All these things, those are expensive and they're complicated tools. Our niche is to try to, is turning into a sales pitch, sorry, but our niche is to try to be sort of an alternative to that. If you've gone down that road already, or you didn't go down that road because it's too expensive and complicated, we do offer network-based visibility that can sort of be this is a horrible way to say it, but like a poor man's SIM. Like it does the same effect, right? We're collecting net flow, we're collecting those alerts that trip on the device, and we're telling you when something goes bad. Does that make sense? We have larger, more sophisticated companies that will use our tool on the inside and the outside, and we feed into a larger SIM. Like we work with MSPs as part of a larger solution. So I wouldn't say we would replace an MSP because they're probably doing things for you that we don't do, but we have many relationships with MSPs, and we're one of the tools in their toolbox. Yes, sir.
When your analysts are reporting, do you mainly say, hey, this is the vulnerability, or this is the reason this is possibly a potential risk, this is the risk factors, and it kind of explains why they should resolve this, the reason this port shouldn't be open,
Right.
vulnerability. Is that something that you would provide to the customer?
Yes, on the case by, yeah, exactly. So he's saying, do we provide sort of the context around the alert that tripped, or the reason we're reaching out to them? And the answer is yes. You know, we plug in, again, a lot of our customers are small. They may have a security person on staff, maybe, or maybe they don't. So we plug in a lot of times, back to the MSP question, we plug in as like their security resource, sort of by default. So if something's going wrong, sometimes we get tickets that come from the customer that say, my firewall said this. Well, we're not their firewall vendor, but we'll answer the question because they don't know who else to ask, if that makes sense. So our support team is sort of legendary in that way. Like, we don't care. We'll help you in any way that we can. So yes, we'll provide context around the reason this alert is tripping is because you have this device that has this vulnerability. Here's the CVE for it. You know, here's the whatever context you need. And then usually it's back to those cliche things. It's back to, well, patch it. Just patch it. You know, wipe the device and make sure everything's up to date and the problem goes away. Like, That's where that safety net that would
Pretty awesome.
that would identify that. Yeah. So, any other questions? Lunch is provided by, I don't know who's sponsoring lunch, but thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.